Welcome to the first annual Cabs of Distinction event. This is our inaugural panel discussion titled Paso Robles Past and Future of Cabernet World. I'd like to welcome Steve Heimoff with Wine Enthusiast Magazine. And Steve is so excited about this panel, he said, do we really have to keep it to just an hour? So we will extend it a little bit longer than that, which will mean that your time tasting a little bit later on will be cut down to about an hour and a half from 2 hours, but it will really give you an opportunity to engage this morning. So with that being said, Steve, thank you for being here. Oh, absolutely. Oh, how could I forget that? Thank you, Steve. I would like to take a moment to thank all of our generous sponsors, and you'll see them listed on page 16, but specifically Smurfit Napa, our title sponsor this year, very graciously has supported the backbone of this organization. We thank them very much. With that being said, Steve, it's your show.
Thank you, Linda. How's the audio? Everyone can hear? Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for coming. Welcome to this first inaugural event. And my name is Steve Heimoff, and my title is California Editor for Wine Enthusiast Magazine. And I've done that for about 21 years. And I remember my first visit to Paso Robles was actually with Gary Eberly. And I don't even want to think how long ago that was. It was a long time ago. And he hasn't changed at all. But what has changed is wine in Paso Robles. And I have to say that this past year, for me, has been almost like the tipping point, not almost, the tipping point in my own thinking about Paso Robles. And I mean that sincerely. Something has turned here, and that's one of the things I'm going to ask the winemakers on this panel to address is what accounts for this dramatic, shocking increase in quality, and particularly in the red wines, I would say. I don't know. Maybe it's a succession of cooler vintages that we've had since 2009, 2010. But whatever it is, Paso Robles has, in my judgment, fulfilled the early expectations that it would become a great wine growing area. But, having said that, these things don't happen overnight. And although Paso Robles has a fairly long history, and I don't myself know exactly when the first grapes went in, I would guess with the Padres, the mission fathers in the 19th century, but as a modern region, it's fairly young, and we are very fortunate that to have one of the modern pioneers with us, Gary Eberly, and in his remarks, he'll tell us a little bit about that. But really, the modern era here is only, 35 years, which is a blink in the eye when it comes to, figuring out the land, the terroir, the lay of the land, what grapes, what clones, what rootstocks, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. I mean, the Bordelais have had, 1,500 years. Burgundians probably about the same time. So, what Paso Robles has done in 35 years is really, really remarkable. And as a critic, I'll just finish by saying that I think that the future is fantastic for this region. So having said that, we do have a great panel. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to keep your remarks to about 10 minutes, if you can. I know you all have a lot to say. And that will enable us to have some time at the end for a Q&A with all you guys. So without further ado, let me introduce Gary Eberly, and each one of you in turn, you can just introduce yourselves. I'm not going to introduce the rest of you. And please, Gary, you were such a star, such a pioneer down here. So why don't you tell us, how you got here and what you saw in terms of your vision?
Well, the first time I saw Paso Robles was in 1972. I was at UC Davis working on a doctorate in viticulture and enology. And Dr. Olmo, Harold Olmo, who was probably the America's greatest viticulturist, he was on my committee, and the department was doing soil analysis for the Vit department and also for soil science. And I was fortunate to make 3 trips down here with Doc Olmo and Doc Alley. And I got to carry the shovel and all of the soil samples, and I got to work the shovel. And we walked and drove around and took soil samples from most of what is the major areas of what is Paso Robles now, and took them back to the university. But I remember Dr. Olmo especially being so high on the potential that he saw in Paso Robles, primarily because of the weather, the dry, lack of humidity, the very cold nights, because it gets cold here at nights, even in July and August. But also the fact that a large bulk of what the soils that he liked were very poor. And it was, I remember going on a particular piece of land, it was so pretty and had a lot of oak trees on it and everything. And I'd say, man, this is nice. And he'd hit me on the back of the head with a shovel. And he said, haven't you learned anything? The Europeans for 2 millennium have learned that you put your grapes on your poor soil and you put your tomatoes and your row crops down on your good soil. And he liked the fact that Paso had relatively infertile soils. So when I came to Paso Robles in May of '73, I was fortunate enough to talk some folks into getting established down here. And I planted over the next 5 years 700 acres of grapes and built the Estrella River winery, Estrella River, Estrella River. And we designed it to be 48,000 cases, and 10 years later, the last year I was there, we were doing 300,000. Most of the grapes that we produced, we were selling into Napa to wineries like Mondavi and San Martin, Ed Friedrich up at San Martin. That wasn't Napa, but I would say at least half of our production was being sold into Napa Valley, even at that time. A lot of people recognized the quality. And I came down here, and Doc Olmo, everybody said, this was going to be the next great red wine producing region. I came down, I got into wine. I've never done anything but go to school and make wine. I've never had an honest job. I spent a lot of time in school, though, because that's where they keep the cheerleaders. But I remember getting down here, and I came for Cabernet. The clone of Cabernet that I have is Dr. Olmo's. Actually, there were 2. Even he said he wasn't sure they were different clones, but it was his clonal numbers 101 or 102 that came from the Madame de Pin's vineyard. It was George Latour's daughter, and this was the vineyard that the BV Private Reserve was made from exclusively through, I think, 74 or 75 when Hubeline bought them, and then it changed a little bit. But it's a very shy producing clone. I don't know the current number when they changed all the numbering systems. I think it's 6. 6? Okay. Well, it's a very shy producing clone. It's a small berry, typically weighs a quarter to a seventh of a pound. Piece of skin wrapped around 4 seeds, but it makes a very soft, you don't have to squeeze the hell out of it to get good color and good phenolics. So you don't get as many gallons of juice out of it either, but it makes rather spectacular wine. And I would say from through about 1995 or more, even later into the 90s, the majority of grapes, Cabernet grapes in the appellation were this clone 101, 102, or 6, because we at Estrella, we were the major source of wood. When people started coming into the area and propagating, we would sell them the wood. I remember it was 10 cents a stick for an 18-inch cutting. The other thing at the time I did, and I think, I look back on it, and I'm glad I did it, but I wish it had. I planted the first Syrah vineyards in the United States since at least the repeal of Prohibition here in Paso, and sold Randall Graham and Steve Edmonds and Bob Lindquist their first Syrah. And, we've been sort of dubbed the Rhone zone, which is fine. We do spectacularly with the Rhone varieties, but Cabernet in Paso represents about 50%, maybe a little bit more of the grapes planted, and the Rhones are probably less than 10% of the grapes in the Paso Robles appellation. I think Cabernet is our best grape. In fact, there's no doubt in my mind that it's our best grape. And I think we do remarkably well with it. And I would encourage you, if you get a chance, we're going to have a couple bottles of an older cab under the table when we're pouring. Take a look at how well an old Paso Robles Cabernet ages. I think it'd be remarkable. And it's not just our wine, it's the wines. I have a library of wines from Cabernets from all over the appellation, in the 70s and 80s. And I'm not saying they're all good wines, because some of the early, one of the things that Steve was talking about is Paso just seems to have exploded. We had to have a critical mass. Paso was making some very good wines 35 years ago. I've been here 40 years, but there weren't many. And for everyone that was making a good wine, there were a lot of home winemakers making some rather average wines. And I think it really held us back. And we finally got to the point where not just home winemakers, but enologists and trained winemakers started coming down here and started showing up with new and modern equipment and modern wineries and good viticultural and enological techniques. And all of a sudden, Paso is turning out not 6 good wines a year, but they're turning out 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 good wines. And the wine writers and the public, I think, finally had to look and say, wow, hey, there's something going on here. And I think that's a major reason why Paso has leapt forward in the last 10 years. We've gotten that critical mass, and we've got some outstanding wineries and wines coming out of Paso Robles that it's hard to keep up. We've never done anything, and we've been making wine I've been down here for 40 years, but it's hard to keep up with the competition. It used to be relatively easy. Now, we're being forced to really constantly evaluate what we're doing and trying to stay forward. Is that enough history, Steve?
Works for me.
Okay.
I did want to ask one thing. And when you were saying, you have the 1980 cab under the table, it's not a secret anymore. What was the alcohol on that, and what are your alcohols today?
I believe the alcohol on the 80 was right at 13. This wine, I believe, is 13.9 or 13.8. There are only 2 wines that we chase. We don't chase alcohol. There are 2 wines that you will normally see from Eberle where the alcohols are higher than what is it normally considered, and that's Zinfandel, because of the way it ripens. It's so hard to make a Zinfandel at less than 15. It just because you're going to have Cabernet. The nicest thing about Cabernet, there's no grape in the world that is so gracious to you in the vineyard. It doesn't rot. It's got that thick skin. It's an open cluster. It handles just about anything you can do in the vineyard. And when we pick our 18 acres at the estate vineyard, every grape that we bring in 2 days is probably within 3 degrees sugar of every other grape there. We'll bring in a cluster of Zinfandel, and there'll be 10 degrees difference on one cluster. You get raisins on the shoulder and berries just going through veraison down on the bottom of the cluster. So, and Zinfandel's got that thin skin, and it rots so easy. But you wind up bringing the grapes in when those raisins rehydrate, and you get a higher alcohol. The other one I find that I get higher alcohol than I would like to see, but we found that it makes a better wine, is Viognier. That you really seem to need to get that, to bring out that stone fruit character in Viognier, the peach, apricot, that you need to get it just a little riper than you would, say, a Chardonnay or a Sauvignon Blanc or one of the other white wines.
And the other thing that I wanted to ask was about vintage variation, because I've been fascinated, and a lot of people have been, that the last, certainly 2010, 2011, 2012, felt really chilly by normal coastal California standards. Is there vintage variation down here, and if there is it sort of the same throughout the appellation, or does it depend on where you are?
It's pretty much, I would say, within the Paso Robles appellation. There are cooler areas and there are warmer areas, but it's pretty, I would say, pretty standard. What we get here, they get in Shandon, and they get out at where Justin is, and the same type. Vintage variations. 1979 was the coldest vintage I ever experienced in Paso, certainly. And I always considered that the vintage from hell. I remember picking the last of the Cabernet on December 7th. And I remember it because it's December 7th. The hottest vintage I ever remember was 1984. And we were picking Chardonnay about the 10th of August. So, there's vintage variations. For what it's worth, with rare exceptions, the odd-numbered years seem to be the best. I can go back 77, 81, 85, 87, 89, 91, which is my personal favorite as far as I think that's the best wine I ever made was 1991. 95, 97, 99, 01, 02, 03, 07, which is, I think, the greatest vintage in Paso Robles, if not California, ever. And then 09 and 11 has been really outstanding.
So last question then, in all your years of making Cabernet, what are you doing different, if anything, now than you were back then?
Well, since I've not been the winemaker officially since 97, and Ben Mayo is our winemaker, and he's a much better winemaker than I ever was. But what the main difference on Cabernet is that Ben likes to use more the French oak. When I was making my Cabernet, my reference wine for Cabernet was the 68 BV Private Reserve. All of it aged in American white oak, and that's what I did. I mean, we had French oak for the Chardonnays and the Syrah and different things, but I used American oak. Ben likes French oak on the cab. He likes the wine in the barrel a little less time than I liked. I wanted 24 months on everything. He prefers 18 months. And I said we get about the same amount of oak in the wine from the differences in the species. But other than that, it's the one area that I've told Ben, I said, this is the Eberle Winery protocol, and pretty standard. He has changed yeasts on us. Thank God there's some great yeasts available that we never even thought of, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. We were always using, these hydrogen sulfide generators, and then working to get the hydrogen sulfide out of the wine before you bottled it. One thing about our 09, give me just a minute to talk about it. It is 100% Cabernet. It is the Clone 101, 102, or Clone 6. It is grown on its own roots, our estate vineyard, and the Steinbeck Syrah, which is another one of our partners' vineyards, are own rooted. And when I first planted, when we were first coming down here, all the wineries came down in the 70s. There was really no phylloxera in the area, and everybody was using potted plants, and there was an explosion of planting going on around the state. And we felt very comfortable going in on own roots. Now anything we plant has to go on rootstock. We have phylloxera in the area. It's come in on equipment. It's come in with a lot of rootings and cuttings over the last 2 decades. So it's no longer economically feasible. But if you are curious what pre-phylloxera French wines are like, or if you can think you can tell a difference on a vine that is grapes that are grown on their own roots, Cabernet roots, that's our 09 Cabernet. And I said in my cellar, I have a lot of wines from the 70s and 80s that are own-rooted. I think that's my 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Gary Eberle. Scott.
And I'm Scott Shirley. I'm the winemaker for Justin Vineyards and Winery. And I'd like to first thank Gary for not only being an ambassador for Paso Robles, but really I consider the godfather. He helped not only bring the appellation into being, not only brought the appellation into being, but nurtured it throughout its adolescence and now is helping guide Paso Robles into the future. I'm a newcomer to Paso Robles, so 2012 was my first vintage here, but I make wine for Justin Vineyards and Winery, which was one of the other pioneers for the region. Collectively, we've been farming these vineyard sites for over 30 years now. That doesn't mean that we know everything, but we are continuing to learn about which clones, which rootstocks, which varieties do best in each region. There were 3 reasons for my moving to Paso Robles, and in order to make a great wine, you need 3 things. So you need great soils, great climate, and great people. And as Gary mentioned, the calcareous soils that we have here are fantastic for Cabernet Sauvignon. The hot days during the growing season for ripening Cab. And then the people, not only the panelists up here today, but really there are a lot of new young winemakers moving to the region who are committed to quality and paying attention to all the details that are necessary to make world-class, ultra-premium red wines. And one of the wines that I feel helped bring Paso Robles to prominence or recognition, not only amongst critics, but consumers, is the Isosceles blend. And this is a Bordeaux blend. Justin is known for 2 Bordeaux blends. We have the Justification, which is a Cabernet Franc Merlot blend, fashioned after the right bank chateaus in Bordeaux, and then Isosceles, which is a left bank blend. So the Isosceles has 3 components in it, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cab Franc. And I'm a strong advocate for blended wines. I cut my teeth on Bordeaux blends, Bordeaux reds in Napa Valley at Opus One, and where I worked for 6 years on the winemaking team, and then moved to the Hess collection on Mount Veeder, where I was the winemaker for 7 years. And then decided to move to Paso Robles because I feel that the potential here for great Cabernets is just kind of burgeoning or coming into being. The Isosceles blend does have those 3 varieties, and the 3 sides of the triangle represent those 3 varieties. So Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot. And I like to think of the 3 points on the triangle when I'm making the blends. The 3 points, I think, represent tannins, fruit, and acidity. And over time, aging in the bottle, those 3 things will change. The acidity stays the same, but in a young wine, the tannins are very prominent. They will soften over time. The fruit is very fruit-forward with a young wine, but that diminishes over time. And I'm really trying to find the perfect balance or harmony between those 3 elements, so that when you take a sip, you're not trying to pick them out or analyze the wine. You really just want to have another glass. And the 2009 vintage of Isosceles is 94% Cabernet Sauvignon, and then just 3% Cab Franc and 3% Merlot. And it spends 24 months. In this particular vintage was 64% new French oak, but that changes from vintage to vintage depending on the season and the growing conditions and what really is best for the wine. The 2011 vintage, which I was able to put together, was still separate in different barrel lots. So when I arrived a year ago in April, we had over 150 different barrel lots. So each vineyard block is picked separately, hand-picked, fermented in its own tank, then barreled down separately so it can be evaluated on its own merit. So I tasted through 150 different barrel lots and started assembling blends. And the 2011 Isosceles, I used more Merlot because it was a cooler vintage. As Steve mentioned, the last few vintages have been a little bit cooler. But Merlot having thinner skins than Cabernet Sauvignon, and we have some vineyards on the east side as well as the west side. The Merlot did a better job of ripening, and consequently, I put more into the blend. We can also adjust how much time the wine spends in barrel. So normally the isosceles will spend 24 months in barrel, but with a 2011, which is a little lighter, more elegant wine, I'm only going to leave it in barrel for 21 months. So having that flexibility and really paying attention to the wine itself as it ages in barrel is what I think is going to really bring Paso Robles into the future.
Scott, can you tell us in your 2009, what does the oak bring to that wine? Is it an aroma? Is it a taste? Is it a texture?
I do extensive Cooper trials each vintage, so I'll put the exact same Cabernet Sauvignon into a dozen different Cooper's barrels. And you can request the same forest, the same tightness of grain, the same toast level from a dozen different Coopers, and you get a dozen different finely nuanced barrels. And I'll evaluate those after the wine has been in the barrel for over a year and make sure that the barrel is bringing what I want or what I intend to the wine. I notice on the 2009 some caramel or brown sugar, molasses, vanilla that's coming from the barrel. But I also want the barrel to really support or showcase the fruit and not cover it up. So on the mouth, I find a lot of that fruit, boysenberry, black cherry, but also a nice sweetness or texture on the mid-palate. And
So where are these grapes come from? Are they all over? Like the Merlot is from the east and the Cabernet is from the
It
west?
depends on the vintage. So we do have Cabernet. We have all 5 Bordeaux varieties, and I can't say specifically where the fruit came from with 2009 since I just started last year. But I'm familiar with the vineyard sites now, and the same vineyard sites won't always be used. It depends on the vintage anomalies with the ripening conditions. We're really just trying to make the best wine possible from a given vintage and not focus on specific vineyard sites.
So I often wonder, like, we make a lot of single vineyard wines. I mean, everyone fusses about the vineyard designated this or that. And certainly, in Bordeaux, you look at the great chateaus, and those are all basically single vineyard wines. So how do you sort of explain that, like, your attitude, your philosophy is that blending over from the whole area can fill in the divots and make for a more complete wine, whereas sort of, the notion in the public that a vineyard designated wine is better. Certainly the marketplace rewards vineyard designated wines with higher prices. I've never quite figured that out.
I haven't either, because I think you can make a better wine by blending and finding what's missing from the blend, tasting through the 150 different lots. When I start putting together a core Cabernet Sauvignon blend and then tasting it and saying, well, it needs a little bit in the middle. It needs some more texture, so I'll use some barrels from this lot. Or it needs more aromatic, so I'll choose some Cabernet Franc from over here. Or it needs a little Merlot in order to soften the tannins on the finish. And really kind of just creating a blend or a masterpiece that is well balanced and doesn't have anything sticking out or isn't disjointed. In terms of a single vineyard, I think we have about 80 acres of estate fruit, and really the benefit of having estate acreage is that you're able to control every facet of the growing and the farming. You're not relying on other growers to do as you wish.
That's interesting. So does that mean that you don't have total control over the fruit that you purchase?
Well, we do purchase some fruit from growers, but they're long-term relationships, planting contracts, so that we work very closely with them, and after harvest, invite them to taste the wines made from their grapes, and then give them feedback in terms of what they may have done wrong or what they could improve on the following year.
And finally, Scott, what would you say or what would your recommendation be for drinking the 09 now, 5 years, 20 years?
Well, I strive to make a wine that's enjoyable upon release or approachable upon release, but that's going to benefit from a little time in the bottle. So I think the 2009 is tasting nice today. It's showing well, but I would still lay it down for another 3 or 4 years. I don't think it's reached its peak quite yet.
Thank you, Scott Shirley.
Well, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Kevin Willenborg, I'm the winemaker for Paso Robles Winery here in Paso. And I guess I'd like to start off by saying I'm happy to be part of Gary's dream that he started off, which my understanding is coming from Prague over the last day or so. Is that right? He's probably feeling very much in a dream state today. But my perspective, I've been in the industry coming upon my 30th harvest coming up. Many different places I've spent with winemaking. Here in Paso Robles recently, I just moved down from Napa Valley fairly recently. As a matter of fact, there's 3 members on this panel, 3 winemakers on this panel who have just moved down from the Napa Valley in the last couple of years.
That tells you something.
Yes, and I guess, yeah, exactly. It gives you, it's a testament to, I think, Gary's vision from way back when, that there's enough of us who believe now in Paso Robles of the potential of quality in its own right. My perspective, just looking at the region as in general, what makes Paso Robles unique? It's a very large Appalachian region. It eventually may get broken down into different districts. As you move around, there's various temperature profiles, slightly different soil profiles, and each of them, expressing different fruit characteristics that gets made into wine. But I guess how I would define it, what ties Paso Robles together, the three aspects would be, one, it has a high diurnal temperature variance here in California compared to other regions. There are days, as many of you know, where during the growing season, where temperatures can climb as high as 100 degrees, maybe even more. Yet at nighttime, it's very typical for temperatures to get down into the 50s, sometimes 40s at night. And there may be variation, again, due to the different districts within Paso Robles. But generally, there are some high temperature variants that you see here. The other thing is, as Gary pointed out, it's very limited soil profiles as far as nutrients. And I also would add to that very calcareous nature, very alkaline soils, high pHs, which also produce limiting stresses on the plants, which, again, as Gary pointed out, is actually beneficial for producing high fruit quality, limiting the vine's vigor, which is very paramount with Cabernet Sauvignon because it tends to be a very vigorous variety in and of its own right, so you don't want it in vigorous soil conditions. We want the vine to be balanced more in its energy into producing, putting energy into berry fruit, not into vegetative growth. So having limiting soils is a key aspect of all of that. And lastly, I would say, and maybe in part due to the previous 2 aspects, is I think you'll find a very rich, expressive, bold fruit characteristic emanating from the region. And it's a commonality I find in a lot of the wines in the area. Just this richness, this ripeness of fruit. And I would say a roundness of tannin texture, almost a creaminess in the palate. And it seems to carry through in many of the wines I see from Paso Robles overall. There's enough ripeness where you get that physiological maturity, which I think is paramount to making great wines. And that's what I mean by the skin tannin developing, the flavors, the color, and the seed tannin as well. They get mature, and they play a big part in the texture of the wine. So those are the 3 aspects I would say that I find Paso Robles in general. Let me see, back up here a little bit. Vina Robles started in the mid-90s. Our ownerships comes of Swiss heritage. The word's gotten out to them in Switzerland of the uniqueness of Paso Robles way back when. They saw potential, they saw the adventurous nature of the region, and were very much attracted to it. So they started planting vineyards in the 90s, and now Vina Robles is very highly focused on Cabernet Sauvignon and some other varieties as well. We are an estate-focused vineyards, Vina Robles, so all of our fruit is that you see, we have a core of estate vineyard focus. And what you have in front of you today is our 2009 Mountain Road Reserve. Now this is the highest expression of what Vina Robles does in a Cabernet Sauvignon, what we put out there. It retails for only $45 a bottle. But with it, there is just a lot of fruit, a lot of texture to this wine. It comes from our Adelaide Springs Ranch, which is west of here, west of Paso Robles. If any of you know where Tablas Creek is, it's west of Tablas Creek. It's 12 miles from the Pacific Ocean. The vineyard is up at about 1,700 feet, nice southwesterly facing slopes. Linné Colado soil profile types, very steep sloped. There's some calcareous, very calcareous soil nature, very limited yields we get on the vineyard. Typically 2.5 tons to the acre is really all we get. But the vines tend to be just very naturally balanced and just have this density of fruit and just layers of texture into the wine. And what we aim to create once we get what I call that physiological ripeness, which I see in this fruit coming from the region, is we try and balance that in the winemaking process. We bring in the fruit, and we try not to over extract the wine or under extract the wine. So the fruit was taken, it was sorted, and put into small fermentation tanks using both pump over and punch down techniques to try and get the right extraction on the grapes. And once the tannin profile is extracted enough into the wine, we take it off the skins and just so we have that palate creaminess without over extracting and too much dryness or astringency. So we're trying to achieve a richness, a roundness with the layers, without too much astringency on the palate. And that's a uniform style that we're trying to create at Vina Robles. So this wine also, it's 98% Cabernet Sauvignon, and it's 2% Petit Verdot. Again, all from the Adelaide Springs Ranch. The Petit Verdot adds a little bit of structure and some tannin to the wine. But in 2009, was a pretty big year as far as tannins for the grapes. It was very much statewide. I know here in Paso, tasted many wines up in Napa and the North Coast. Very big year with tannins as well. But I think what you'll find here is there's enough palate creaminess that it's not too aggressive.
So I have a question. You have worked, or you guys in the audience should know or be told that Kevin's worked in some really sensational places, okay? He was in Napa Valley for a long time where he worked at Louis Martini and at Francis Coppola's Rubicon, which is now Inglenook. You were at Petrus in Bordeaux, a small winery some of you may have heard of. You were in Santa Barbara County for a while at Firestone and Bridlewood. And now you're here, so I'm going to ask you a tough question. Take the Cabernets or the Clarets, the red wines from Petrus, Napa Valley, and here, and how are they similar? How are they different? And because of your international experience, is there an emerging international style to Cabernet Sauvignon, where they're more alike from all over the place than they used to be.
Yeah. Wow, that is very loaded. So, let me start with that. I truly believe that every region has its regional profile. And I don't think it's appropriate to try and make one wine the same way in the different regions altogether. Obviously, taking Bordeaux in France as an example, I mean, the growing conditions are completely different there in Bordeaux than they are here in California. So they get a lot more rainfall than we do year-round. Usually it's typically very arid and dry in California. We get a richness and ripeness to our style generally in California overall compared to what you would normally get in Bordeaux. So I know there are many in Bordeaux now within the last 10 years that are looking to achieve more of a richer, riper style, kind of more of a California style, although you will never get a Frenchman to admit to that. It's definitely taking root over there. For the last 2 years, a couple years, I was working at Rubicon Estate in Inglenook. We had a consultant from Bordeaux, Stéphane de Renoncourt. He has been coined as Bordeaux's favorite rebel. And he is really kind of uprooting the establishment over there. And his preference is more for a richer, riper style over in Bordeaux. But then again, sometimes the tannins in Bordeaux don't achieve the same roundness, I would say, as they get ripe. So it's a different animal altogether. I'm not saying one's better than the other. It's just different. And then from Napa to here, I mean, they both make very good, the areas produce very great cabs. I mean, I don't think anybody disputes that. I think, again, what I see is just slightly different variances in some of the styles that you can produce from the two different regions. And I highlighted here in Paso, I think there's a certain more roundness to the tannins that we get here. I think we equally get the layers and maybe this rich, ripe fruit, especially with Cabernet Sauvignon, but a little bit more roundness of the tannin. I remember in Rutherford there was, as Charles Thomas at Quintessa coined it, you have to tame the tannins coming out of there. And I think we have an easier time just naturally with the fruit here where we don't have to fight the tannins as much.
I just want to add that I think it's pretty much accepted now that Bordeaux really is warming in a way that it's not clear yet whether California or coastal California is, but Bordeaux certainly is by all accounts. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Sure.
Steve Peck with J. Lower Vineyards and Wines. Good morning. Recently read an account by Doris Goodwin, author of Team of Rivals, the Abraham Lincoln's preparation for the Gettysburg Address, and which, at least according to one account, occurred on the train from Washington to Gettysburg. I want to assure you that I warmed up on my comments before I left the house this morning. So while I may not move you the way Lincoln did for the crowd in that day, I did try to put together something that I hope you'll find informative. Let's see. When I was 19 years old, I took a trip to Napa Valley. I guess I was already admitted to UC Davis, classmate of Kevin's, actually. And maybe a decade behind Gary, maybe a decade ahead of Scott and David. I'll be 50 this year. So I knock on the door at Joseph Phelps Vineyards, hand in my resume, and they, of course, they tell me thanks, but we're covered for harvest. And a couple weeks later, thanks to a water skiing accident, one of the cellar workers went down in, I got the call, put me in, coach. And so that launched my career in the wine business. Did 3 harvests there. 1983 was the first vintage that Craig Williams was head winemaker, and Walter Shug had moved on at that time. Had a great group of companions, and today remaining my my lifelong friends really came out of a cluster of guys that worked harvest during that period. One of the wines we made while I was there, 1984 Napa Valley Cab, I recently looked up the Wine Spectator scores for 91 points. Wonderfully minty, the review said. So
Today that would be 64.
yes, yeah. So that's what occurred to me. And so it's not just things that have changed here in Paso Robles, but I think it's, at least over the state of California and perhaps globally, our perception of Cabernet Sauvignon as a society has changed. It wasn't until 1991 that the word methoxypyrazine occurred in the American Journal of Enology and Viticulture. So, and for those of you that don't know what pyrazines are, methoxypyrazines, it's the odor-active compound in green bell peppers, and it's the compound behind the mintiness, behind the vegginess in Cabernet Sauvignon. So, winemakers of my generation, we weren't given, the full instruction manual on what was going on in these grapes and in these wines, and I think we're still decoding that, that information. Yet that particular piece of the puzzle, I think, led to the advent of hang time in the 90s, which really became the style of the 90s, because that was the winemakers' really their only tool to manage green flavors. They didn't know where the pyrazines came from, but they knew how to get rid of them, which was to let the fruit ripen on the vine a little longer. So if you take even that same wine and fast forward and look at, instead of the 84 vintage, you look at the 94 vintage, you start seeing characters like bold and I don't know, well, yeah, but basically characters that you would associate with overripeness, whether it's late harvest characters, porty characters, madderized, flabby, anyway, a lot of mid '90s, late '90s, even into the early 2000s wines were really. Got a lot of great scores, but it kind of created a divisiveness between producers, between wine writers. Is this really where we want to go? A lot of I think winemakers that weren't really compelled to go that direction were kind of left out, and a little bit they were frowned on for a period of time, like McCarthyism. But with as opposed to hang time. I mean, if you were a heretic, if you were still picking at 24, 25 bricks. Move forward into the new millennium, and now thanks to even I think some of the folks at Cheval Blanc and other places, they've learned not only how to detect methoxypyrazine in wine, but in grapes as early as from set, so they're looking at those little green hard berries in the first week of June after the flowers have set to berries, and they monitor them throughout the growing season, and we sort of learned that you can manage the formation of those pyrazines, sort of work on the supply side rather than just relying on hang time to let those pyrazines dissipate. So at Lore, I think we're a pretty studious and technical group. I think it's one of the bits that's in our toolbox is to we're really devotees of the pressure bomb, which allows us to measure the water status of the vine, and that water status during those early summer months of June and July really sets the platform for getting good ripe fruit out of the area. I think it is a little more inherent in a dry region like Paso Robles that it might, where a foot of rain is common, where the soil water holding capacity is so low. as opposed to if you're in Napa Valley where maybe it's closer to 2 or 3 feet of rainfall with soil water holding capacities roughly double what they are here. And, probably people in this room could speak with much more authority than I can, but my connection to Bordeaux is that, it's not the warm vintages you want to buy, it's the dry vintages. Those tend to be the best vintages that come out of Bordeaux. So there's our opportunity here in Paso Robles. We're kind of not working from like a rainfall reduction where we're using cover crops to draw out soil moisture, but the opposite. We're actually having to become experts at driving soil moisture up, through irrigation, of course. Depending on what part of town you're in and what kind of soils you're sitting on. The wine I brought today is our 2010. So the 3 wines preceding this were all 09 vintage. This is the first of 3 wines that are representative of the 2010 vintage here in Paso Robles. Although we have quite significant acreage of Malbec, which I like to use primarily for Merlot-based blends. And one person thinks that we have more Petit Verdot planted than all of Bordeaux. I don't know if that's true. I think we have a couple hundred acres, and I think we might have at least 10% of what's in Bordeaux. I mean, there's less than 500 hectares, I believe, in all of Bordeaux, Petit Verdot. Need to check that. And so this particular blend is 99% Cabernet Sauvignon, 1% Syrah. We felt kind of punched up the fruit. It was an intentional decision that we made on this blend. We, of course, we're crafting with French oak élevage, and we really try for a style that kind of puts the fruit forward and kind of keeps the oak signature just behind the varietal signals. So in this case, it was about 50% new French oak, and I hope you enjoy it.
I have one quick question. Several people have referred to, and Gary alluded to this too, to the fact that part of the recent renaissance, resurgence, whatever word, in Paso Robles is because there's new talent moving down, there's new money moving in, and talent and money, obviously are going to raise quality. But that really raised a very interesting question concerning terroir. 2 generations of American wine writers have written that Napa makes the best Cabernet because it has the best terroir for Cabernet. But is that really true? Or is it because Napa had more talent and money to make better wine? And so maybe this whole thing of terroir is kind of not true, that within a very broad context of different terroirs, you can make very, very great wine, provided that the human investment is there.
Well, last time I checked, I think the human element is part of the terroir definition. And
It depends how you define. Emile Pinot says that terroir plus human is cru. So he refers to cru to wrap the people in, and terroir is just Mother Nature.
Well,
But however,
yeah. I'm kind of unusual in that the Lohr family, of course, has 34 acres on Pratt Avenue in St. Helena. So I still have my foot in the door making Napa Valley Cab and Petit Verdot every year. And so and I'll tell you, in some vintages, I mean, the grapes that landed on my doorstep in 2011 were pretty rough. I got to tell you. From Napa, right, and similarly in '09, and so we. I think there's ups and downs in all vintages, or in all appellations, and of course when there's a vintage definition for Napa, it kind of becomes the norm for the whole state of California, and a lot of times we get kind of painted within that picture, and it certainly doesn't always fit. But I think when I moved to Paso Robles in 2001, I think I know Gary was of course here. Tom Meyer at Castoro is another UC Davis Masters. I can't think of anybody else that was here at that time. I came the same year that Larry Turley came. I knew Larry from moonlighting back in the 80s. So I figured if he was headed down this way, if it's good enough for Larry, it was good enough for me. And but now, I mean, we see here at the table, three new talents, just pretty new in town, and Daniel bringing all of his passion to the area and all his smarts. I think that I like the maybe we're talking crew and not terroir, but I think the people element is a big part of it.
Okay, thank you again, Steve Peck.
Scoot over here. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? All right. This mic is kind of in a weird spot. Oh, can I be like a rock star? All right. I feel like a stand-up comedian now. First, yeah, exactly. First thing I'd like to do really is to thank the Cab Collective and Steve, and then all of you for spending your morning with us on a Saturday, because Jada logistically is a little bit different than some of the other speakers. We're a 4,000 case winery, and we normally don't get the forum to be able to bring in as many people as you guys do and about Cabernet. So for us and on behalf of the Messina family, I'd like to say thanks. I mean, it's an amazing group of winemakers here, and I'm glad to be a part of that. I'm Dave Galzignato. I'm the winemaker at Jada. Make sure I get the right winery. And Jada was founded by Jack Messina. Jack Messina is a heart surgeon in Florida. Jack looked all over the world, South America, Napa, Sonoma, and a bunch of places in between. He was a Bordeaux guy. And when people were telling him to plant different varieties, he said, I want to find a spot to plant Bordeaux. So he drove along Vineyard Drive and saw this property and talked to a couple of people, and he planted 60 to 70% of the vineyard initially to all Bordeaux, and then 30 to 40% was planted to Syrah. Over the years, Jada Vineyard started, the Messina Vineyard, started just as a vineyard selling grapes to our friends and our neighbors. In 2000, and that was 1998, 1999. In 2005, Jack's a heart surgeon. He's pretty competitive. He looked around and said, my neighbors are making awesome wines. I'm going to make awesome wines. So in 2005 was the first vintage of Jada. And that was basically 50% Rhone, 50% Bordeaux. In 2008, they opened the tasting room and they started producing wine at Jada. They also took some of the Bordeauxs and grafted them to some new clones of Rhones. So right now, Jada stands at about 4,000 cases, where 2,000 are Rhone, 1,000 is Bordeaux, and 1,000 is a blend of the two. In 2011, I came on board, and similar to what Steve was talking about logistics and manpower and investments, a lot of the small wineries, my crew is 1.5 people in the cellar, and I'm one of those 1.5 people. So when you're a 4,000 case winery, logistically it's a little bit different than some of our bigger brothers in the industry. In 2011, Jack made the investment to bring in the first full-time winemaker. The model that he had used prior was assistant winemaker and consultant winemaker, which is pretty common in some of the small wineries. So as of 2011, going forward, now we have a full-time vineyard winemaker in Jada, and I've seen some other wineries do the same thing, and I think that talks to the quality, now having dedicated people and the money to support that, really really helps with the quality. So, and it's a slow process. I think one of the reasons why I moved here is I honestly believe that Paso Robles has the potential to be the best appellation in California. It's a huge statement, but I came from Napa. I'm actually an East Bay boy, but I studied at Davis and then went to Napa, 10 years in Napa. Worked for Charles Krug. In Charles Krug, I tutored under Denis Malbec, which is a third-generation Montreuil for Chateau Latour. So I learned a couple of things about Bordeaux varieties from him. Worked at Duckhorn and worked at Lewis as well. And I think one of the reasons why Jack brought me and our team to Jada was to elevate the level of Bordeaux varieties. So that's kind of the history of why I'm here, where I came from. The wine that you guys are going to have is a 2010 Passing By. And the biggest lots that we make are the 200 to 500 case range. We do a lot of small lot fermentations, like the rest of you guys do as well. But we don't have the option of being able to blend stuff away or cherry pick. We get one shot at it. So we have 20 lots and they all have to be awesome or Dave has to make a new resume type of thing. So what we do is we pay enormous attention to detail, and I think all the key cab producers are doing the same sort of thing. We pick at night. I'm at the winery at 3 o'clock in the morning driving forklift. We've switched to quarter-ton bins, which are smaller bins, so you have less juicing in the boxes. As of 2011, what we did as well is we separated the Rhones and the Bordeaux as far as where we produce them. I really like the French model to where if you go to France, if you go to a chateau, you see they make a red and a white. They don't try to do 11 varieties. We have 11 varieties at Jada. So what I did is I said, okay, Jada's set up to be a Rhone facility. This is what we're going to do. We're going to process all the Rhones here. They have open top tanks, all the equipment for the Syrah, the Mourvèdre, the Grenache. Let's take the Bordeaux varieties and move them to a Bordeaux facility to where we have different tanks, different equipment, so we can make the Bordeaux like a true, typical Bordeaux. I think that really helps have your distinction between, so this way you're not making a Cabernet like a Syrah, or making a Cabernet with Syrah equipment, or Syrah tanks, or what have you. I think those things are really important. So we pick at night. We're mostly a gravity facility, so no pumps or very minimal pump usage, just to keep the varieties delicate and the wines very fresh. I think all these wines have a nice freshness to them. This blend, 2010, I took this wine over right after malolactic, and I had to do a little winemaking black magic to get it to where it is now. But one of the things that I did was try to be very, very gentle, rearrange the barrels, try to make the cab shine like the cab. Normally this wine is closer to 90% Cabernet. This blend is actually 80 Cabernet and 20 Merlot. And the clones that we have are the more phenolic clones. So the nice thing about Jada, being where we're at on Vineyard Drive, is we have 4 clones to choose from. And it's all estate fruit. We have 60 acres that we grow, but we only use 20 for Jada. And a decent amount of the people on the panel actually buy fruit from us. So the nice thing about Jada is it's all estate. We use 20 acres, and we extreme farm and extreme winemaking all of these wines. So we're pretty heavy on French oak. We're about 70%, and the wine stays in barrel for about 18 months. We bottle unfiltered and unfined, so another kind of reserve technique that we like to use. Because we make smaller amounts, we can do that. When I worked at other wineries, it was more difficult to unfilter wines because you were making lots and lots of cases. And if something went wrong, it was more difficult to bring that back. So as a 4,000 case small lot winery, we can do some of these artisan techniques. And really the idea is to bring the soil and the grapes to you guys. We don't want to do much in between. I'm sure I've forgot some things, but anybody have any questions on the panel?
Where is the estate vineyard?
Where is it? Yeah. So it's on Vineyard Drive.
And tell us where that is.
So if you go from here, you head on 46, you get on 101, going south, 46 like you're going to Cambria. Then you take Vineyard Drive, you take it right, as opposed to going to Templeton. You go down towards Dinner, and and Tabos Creek, and we're between Dinner and kind of Opala. And it's very similar vineyards to the group of wineries that include Dinner, Laventer, Booker, Torin, kind of similar soil types that those guys have as well.
Thank you.
All right.
That was David Gowsey and Daniel.
Thank you. Well, I'm the last guy on the group. Is it working? I want to make sure you're not watching Groundhog Day, so I have a challenge ahead of me. I want to start with a story. I had dinner with Gary and Marcy Eberly about 2 or 3 months ago. And I have a large collection of wines from France, from Napa, from other great regions that date back to 1975 and 78 and 80. And Gary brought a 1980 Eberly to dinner. And I brought my Estate Soul of Line, our highest end wine, to dinner. And I looked at the bottle and I saw 1980. And I thought, how am I going to drink this stuff? It's probably way over the hill by now. Well, I have to tell you, it was amazing. Truly a testament of not only a great terroir, but a great winemaking as well. Needless to say, I was competing on finishing the bottle before Gary and Marcy did. So I think that night he drank mine and I drank his. And I asked him for the second bottle, I'm still waiting for it.
Under the table.
Yeah. Exactly. But you know, that brings me up to something. By the way, I am Daniel Dow, and really happy to be here. I think we're surrounded by great people, great winemakers. And Steve, thank you for coming down. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, here we go. It's working now. Okay. Well, you guys heard everything, or should I repeat it? Do I get 2 more minutes, Steve? Do I get my 2 minutes again? Okay. So, you know, that brings me up, though, to a great point that I want to start by making. I'm going to offer a little bit of a different perspective maybe this morning. You know, the beautiful thing about being in Paso Robles is that you have 614,000 acres. So I don't believe you can pin a style, or you can pin a variety, or you can pin anything really on one region that is larger than Napa and Sonoma combined. So every one of us is going to have a little bit of a different perspective on how we see things. And given that I'm a newcomer, this is my 8th harvest in Paso, fairly new. I'm going to offer some things that I think are going to give us, if anything, some food for thoughts on what we ought to do in the next few years to elevate Cabernet for even a higher level than we are today. But starting with the story I told about Gary, it's an important story because it is one of the reasons that we came, my brother and I came to Paso Robles. The reason we came here, one of the first reasons, is because we felt we could achieve ripeness year to year. And that is a big thing, especially when you're dealing with Cabernet Sauvignon and other Bordeaux varietals. We all know how a Cabernet Franc can taste if it's not ripe. And we all know how a Cabernet can taste when the tannins are not ripe. And it's a very tricky thing. For instance, going back to history, looking at 1982 vintage in Bordeaux. A lot of writers, a lot of people tasted the wines. It was a warmer year, higher pHs. People tasted the wine, and what did they say? Oh, gee, these wines are soft. They're not going to age. I give them 5 years. But yet, they were wrong. 30 years later, 40 years later, however many years that is, 30-some years later, the 1982s are fantastic because it's easy to confuse ripe tannins and soft tannins. And what I found here in Paso is we can achieve ripeness. And when Cabernet Sauvignon achieves that ripeness, it is truly fantastic. And it's approachable earlier, and you don't have as much of that pyrazine and that bell pepper that lingers, and the tannins don't scratch your throat as much. We know the tannins are there. We actually measure our tannins year to year. We actually use a wine lab called Wine X-Ray. Scott McLeod, sitting out there, actually owns the lab, does a wonderful job at that. And we measure and we track our phenolics. We know our phenolics are in the top 1% every year, so we know the tannins are there. But to be able to achieve that ripeness is very key. And Paso in general, regardless of where you are, with the warm days, with the cool nights, you're able to achieve this ripeness on a year-to-year basis. And that is truly one of the biggest features that Paso Robles has to offer, I think, today. The second thing that is a big attraction for why we came to Paso, and by the way, I called it Paso Robles first. They told me, no, it's Paso Robles. So then I called it Paso Robles. They said, no, it's Paso. Then I was having dinner with a friend of mine, and I kept on saying Paso, and he looked at me after being drunk after an hour, and he said, I knew Texas grew great grapes, but I didn't know they were that good. But we do call it Paso. It's short and sweet. The second reason that attracted me to come here is that you have these soils that you really only find in special vineyards in the world. If you go to Burgundy, if you go to Bordeaux even, you find what's called argilo-calcaire, calcareous clay soil. And these are very important soil because the clay is going to give you the fatness, the opulence, the bouquet, great characteristic, the ageability for a bottle of wine. But the calcareous is going to give you the minerality. It's going to give you what's very important in a warmer climate like California, the natural acidity. The fact that we're able to achieve ripeness and hang the fruit as long as we need, but not have to add acid to the wine, that is a big thing. Because natural acidity just flows very well into the wine and does not mess around with the balance of the wine. These are the two main reasons we chose to come to Paso Robles. But to answer your question, Steve, what have we seen on our side that is different in the last 8 years? Because we have seen a little bit of a change in Paso Robles and the quality of the Cabernet. Now, some wineries like Gary have focused on low-yielding clones like Clone 6 and other high-quality clones. But the reality of it is a lot of the vineyards around were planted for production. Paso Robles was known for making a great value Cabernet Sauvignon. And when you're making a great value Cabernet Sauvignon, you focus on planting productive clones, not qualitative clones. These are clones that produce clusters that weigh about 200 grams and that really can give you the kind of yield that allows you to actually make a living and sell a bottle of wine for $10 or $15. What we've seen in the last 8 years is a shift, a paradigm shift in that. We're seeing more and more vineyards planting higher quality clones, higher density clones, as opposed to the average of 500 or 700 vines per acre. People are planting 2,300 vines per acre, dropping fruit, and really focusing on achieving ripeness in a very balanced way. Of course, the price goes up, okay? You can't ask for $1,000 a ton if you're getting a ton an acre. And, a lot of producers were hesitant about that. I remember just 5 years ago, I had a very hard time convincing a producer to drop fruit, and I would pay more money, but I would actually want them to drop fruit to about a ton or two an acre. That was almost impossible. But that's changed. A month ago, I was competing with 4 wineries, 2 of them being here, for $4,000 a ton for Cabernet Sauvignon. Okay, I got it, by the way. You see, we have, there's a new word, there's competition and there's cooperation, and there's a whole new word, it's called coopetition. We cooperate, but we compete. And, but the beauty about this is that the more growers start figuring out that there is a market for higher quality Cabernet grapes and Bordeaux grapes, and there is a market for the consumer wanting to pay $50 for a bottle of wine, then the whole quality is going to rise. And that's what, as the PRCC, we're working together toward. We're working on really starting to make the changes as much as we can in the vineyard. So I'll tell you quickly about Down Mountain, which is where our estate is. We're located in Adelaida, which is west side in the Santa Lucia Mountains. The highest elevation in Paso, 2,200 feet elevation. We tend to have a cooler daytime temperature and a little warmer nighttime temperature. So our diurnal shift is actually a little bit smaller than the rest of Paso. Our soil is 100% calcareous clay. So none of our soil is anything else than calcareous clay. So it allows us to really have that minerality that we're looking for, as well as the stress that we're looking for. Probably my favorite part about our vineyard is that we do have quite a bit of precipitation. So even in a drought year like this year, downtown Paso is at 4.6 inches of rain. We're close to 16 inches. The last 2 years, we were at 50 or 60 inches. And what that does is allows enough water to go into the ground to replenish the cover crop and basically really replenish the organic material, which is going to give the grapes and the vines the vitality to form a full canopy. We're always target having about a 4 to 4.5 foot canopy so that we have a great deal of photosynthesis to actually ripen the grapes. And we're able to do that. If you come to our vineyard today, it's April, we haven't watered once yet, and our cover crop is still green. So there's moisture even down at 4 or 5 feet deep. So that means we typically do not water at all till mid-August. And by mid-August, we obviously measure our pressure bomb on a week-to-week basis. I like to call it our blood pressure. And unless we see the vines are getting ready to shut down or start sucking the water and dehydrating the grapes because they want to survive, then we don't water. And when we actually start watering, we've had 3 harvests already on our mountain. We usually water around mid-August, and we like to do that to extend the period time of about 50 days between veraison and harvest time. Because when you do that, you reach that magical moment where Cabernet is the best time to know when it's ready, is when that skin turns like velvet. And it's kind of like watching the sunset over the water. You don't always see that flash, but when you do, it's a magical moment. It's the same with Cabernet Sauvignon. When that skin turns into velvet, and you don't get to experience that all the time, you know you've reached perfect ripeness. And we do experience that on our mountain year to year. Our estate is planted with about 92 acres today. The average density is about 2,200 vines an acre. We have some blocks that are as high as 2,480 vines an acre. We drop fruit about 3 or 4 times a year to always try to balance the vine. Some years we've been as low as 6 clusters per vine. Some years we've been as high as 18 or 20 clusters per vine. It all depends on the vintage. This wine, quickly, it's our signature wine that we make every year. It's our Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon. It retails for $56. It's aged in 80% new French oak for about 18 or 19 months. 100% of all the wines that are made under the Dow label that I make are free run. In France, we call that vin de goutte, wine of best taste. So we actually try to stay away from seed tannin, and we try to focus on skin tannin by performing long macerations, warmer macerations, to try to balance the tannin, the fruit, and the acidity. That's basically what this wine is. So this is a wine that we release every year around September, and we've released it actually in October 15th. Steve.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
And I'm looking at Linda because I'm thinking there's no time for Q&A, right?
Let's allow 5 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll wrap it up. And I'll give you directions now and allow 5 minutes for Q&A. At the end of this session, if you will, exit to the left and pick up a glass. Our 16 member vintners are going to be sharing their very best in the Stallion Barn here, and lunch will follow here at 1 o'clock. We'll allow about 5 minutes if everybody's okay for Q&A.
Okay, real quick Q&A. Let's see those hands. Nobody. Seriously.
Steve, you
Tim
got to ask me a
McDonald, you got a question? No, well then I will take it out. You know, Danny. Oh, I'm sorry. There is.
I was just laughing before when you guys were talking about terroir plus human
Yeah.
plus crew.
Yeah.
Gary made a remark over there saying, "Yeah, well, Napa had Mondavi, and Mondavi, really did his best to make Napa into Bordeaux."
If Robert Mondavi had been intelligent enough to build his winery in Paso Robles in 1964, Paso Robles would be the center of the wine industry in California. Robert Mondavi drug our industry into the 20th century. He's a guy, he never made wine. I mean, he was never a winemaker. He was the greatest marketing guy, the father of the modern California premium wine industry.
Yeah. That's well said. So Daniel alluded to the size of Paso Robles, and if I recall correctly, you can fit 2 Napa Valley appellations into Paso Robles and still have room for a Clear Lake up in Napa Valley, so in Lake County. So this is a very large appellation, and you know, I really do think that this tipping point has been reached, and these vintners are raising Paso Robles to the next level. And I'll just end by saying I think you ain't seen nothing yet. So thank you all very much for coming. And enjoy the tasting next door.